Good day to you all. Thanks for taking another look at one of the videos. This time around, it's how to construct 1/64th scale engines. So this has been by far the most popular request I've had, is how I go about making the engines. And though I showcased it a few videos back, I actually teased this probably 12 months or so ago on my Instagram and on this channel. So whilst it's not necessarily you could use styrene, you could use a lot of other different materials, other bits of plastics, which I'll go on to in a moment. I've decided to stick this in the Styrene Diaries section, but really it's a method of how I go about making engines. So this was actually the one I did a few videos back, the Escort, which sparked all the interest again. And I'll say right from the off, this video I'm going to make a bit of a Frankenstein engine, because a lot of people have asked, can you do one with carburetors on? One was with turbo, some injection. And we all know there's V8s, V6s, 4-pots, there's all sorts out there. So rather than try and do one specific engine, I'm going to Frankenstein one together, just to sort of get your mindset into how I go about doing them, really. But there's not really a lot of steps to go along with how I go about making them. But I'll just try and get your mindset into thinking along my lines. And I've got a graveyard of parts, not just necessarily die-cast cars, but little bits of electric, little bits of wiring, and all these things come in very, very useful. If you looked at the Time Bandit I did on the channel a few videos, well, probably last year actually now, and the Dukes of Hazzard one, that was actually using some old electric board that was out of an old toothbrush, I think, something like that. And there's bits of wiring that you can pull out of old electrics, some old speaker wire mesh, speaker grill mesh actually from a car, which you can use for grills, paper clips, other little bits just lying around you would normally throw out, all come in very, very handy. So I'll assume that we're going to make these out of styrene then. And I don't necessarily use a lot of different sections, only some round, some tube and some square. The square I use for the main part of the block, and it's the 4mm diameter section. Tubing, don't normally go anything bigger than 2mm, which I cut up for different parts. And then with the rod, I go right down to sort of 1/2 mil. But again, nothing bigger than 2mm, but I go down this fine if I want to do some sort of wiring and some little switches and, well, not switches, but some of the little bits of pipe work and oil filler caps and stuff like that, which we'll get onto in a moment. But if I talk about the tools that you'll need first, I use scalpel blades, a little miter box, especially for cutting of the main engine block, which I'll show you first off in a moment, some sanding sticks or some sandpaper, a little file just to get into some of the nooks and crannies, and a little hand drill. And then finally just some glue, or what I prefer, this mech for the styrene to put together. And that is all the basic tools you'll really need to get going. So if we crack on and start then, the engine itself, the main block, I tend to use this 4mm square to do the main starting. Now, as I said, I'm not going to make an out-and-out replica of an engine, just so I can cover a broader selection, if you like. So for this one, I'm going to do sort of a 4-pot with some injection on the side, but I'll keep referring back to some of the other engines that I've built so I can show you that if there was some carburetors on it or something like that. And really all the detail afterwards of all the wiring is down to personal choice. So let's kick this thing off then, and we'll start by making the main block. Here's the little miter box cutter that I put into a vise. You don't have to go to this expense, but it's all good tools to have in your arsenal. Keeps it nice and secure within them ridges. You can do 45-degree angles, but it's just a lot safer and a lot cleaner to get a good, decent start to where we're going. So here we go, straight away we've got the little block. You Throughout the process, I keep offering it up to the car as I go along, because we can see how it fits and where we're going, and already you can see it's quite wide. This particular car as well, I'm leaving in the standard axle, so there's got that little ridge where the axle is and where the axle's held in place on the chassis, so there's going to have to be a little cutout underneath. But I'll measure it up, I'll make any necessary adjustments straight away, and I'll get straight to sanding it down to the width of it, the length of it, the depth of it, and more importantly, getting that little ridge out of the bottom. So here I am just sanding away just to get the width of it right. Nothing too dramatic early on at this stage, we're just cutting and sanding. And then underneath, as I say, you won't have to do this on every single car, it just depends on what you're building. So because I am doing this one with the wheels already still in place, you won't see all this once the engine manifold, once the exhaust manifolds and the injections on, you won't see all how it dips in underneath to get that clearance. But it's just getting that foundation right to build on thereafter. And once you're happy with it, it's time just to move on to the head of the car, and I'm using some half round section. You could use round bar and cut it down to half round, but it is quite a way of doing that. You could cut the round bit off first and sand it flat to get this half round shape. But once you've got it, cut it to length, sand it around, and you'll have the start of the ridges of the head. Side by side you can see the standard half round at the top there with no shaping, and the one on the left is the one that we've just lightly sanded, and it's literally seconds worth of work to lightly sand, and already we're beginning to make the top of the engine. With this mech stuff, it's really straightforward to use. I've mentioned it in other Styrene Diaries videos. It's methyl ethyl ketone, I think it's pronounced. Probably pronounced that completely wrong, but you literally just lick it against each part and it will melt it together fairly quickly, more or less instantly. And straight away there we have the start. You could put another piece of flat sheet section over the top to create a more in-depth head, if you like, but for this purpose I'm trying to keep it as simple as I can as well, and by just putting another little piece at the back I've created the start of the aesthetics of an engine. So all we've used is half round and a square section so far to make the start of the engine. What we're going to do now is add just to the front of it a cam wheel cover. You don't have to put these on, you could at this stage create the little cam wheels at the front, which I'll show you on another video at the moment, but for this I'm just doing a little basic flat piece cut out and shaped, slightly oversized width of the engine just to give it a bit more shape when we come to put it on. And again, once you've licked a little bit of this mech on it just to seal the deal, all you need is a very tiny amount. You've got a couple of seconds window just to maneuver it around before it sets. But the good thing about it is if it doesn't set in the place you want, you can add a little bit more on it and sort of remelts it if you like, and you can reposition it. But there you go. Some of this lighting does throw a few shadows over this, which does help you in some respects. Then you can sort of sand down the little areas where it's hasn't been cut too well, but Again, keep offering it as you're going along, just for clearance. You'll be amazed, you know, overall the width of this is now sort of under 4mm, and the length of it is probably under 10mm. But when I come to do the exhaust, what I tend to use now is solder wire. And the reason behind that is to bend the actual styrene rod takes some heat. Now, you can either do it too much and it will melt, not enough and it'll crack when you then come to glue it together. So now what I tend to do is use solder wire, which is really straightforward to do. Once you've marked out how many exhaust pieces are coming out your side, I'll then use my little hand drill to drill down. And the good thing about the solder wire is you can keep on manipulating it, you can keep bending it and it won't crack. I sort of fell about on it purely by accident one day while I was making a roll cage, and with it being so easy to cut solder wire and so easy to bend, I thought, well, okay, I'll try twisting and making some fancy manifold at the time to put this turbo one on, and it works really, really well. Just a little bit of glue on the ends, stick it into the block, and you have a pretty successful looking exhaust headers. And it's silver as well, it's metallic, so all in all it's a pretty good solution all round to using the styrene. It's a pain using the styrene at this stage. The cracking, you can spend hours doing this, you know, and it still won't look as good as using this stuff. And once it's in, you could, prior to this stage actually, if I take a step back, you could actually make, like I'm showing you now, sort of the whole base to the manifold bracket. Well, it's not necessarily a bracket, it's actually a part of the manifold, but at this stage I've just stuck it straight in the engine just to show you. But once it's in, as I said, you could bend it and spin it round very, very easily without worrying about it cracking and splitting. And at the end, when I come to paint it, I'll show you can just add a little bit of gold and blue just to sort of show some of the heat discoloration on it, which will finish it off really, really well. But at this stage, you can twist around to your heart's content and make something quite intricate. And any of the ends that are left over, you can trim away as well fairly easily. But already now we've got sort of 4 parts on there now. We've got the main square for the block, some of the half round for the top, a flat sheet for the front, and now some solder wire. So not expensive items. Yeah, again, you could use plastic. I've said this at the start, you could use other pieces of plastic to make this engine block. But once you try fitting it again, you can either slide these little bits of the exhaust underneath the bulkhead to make a more finer finish, or you can trim right up and make it go wherever you want, really. So now we come to make the intake. At this stage you could be doing the carburetors, but I'm choosing to do sort of an injected manifold, and I'm using a smaller square section this time to get the main body of it, which I'll marry to some of this half round section again. You could use the round and file it down to make the half, as I said earlier on, but for speed and quickness I'll use this half section. And all I'm going to do is glue the square to the round, half round even, and then with some very fine sort of 1/2 mil section of the rod, make the little intake parts. And blue tack is a very good for something as thin and light as working with this material. It's a great little self jigging piece I use quite regularly, and it gets really fiddly at this stage, I'm not going to lie to you. So a good pair of tweezers, which I omitted from my little tool section at the start there, you will need. And at this size now, it starts to get irritating like that. And you've got a very quick window, but if you manage to be quick enough, a little bit of the mech solution down and a quick dab of it, you should be able to get it to stick in an instant. And there we have not a micro toothbrush, but the start of this little injection intake, which once you've put them little 3 parts together, literally stick down again by any means you can. I'll use some of this little blue tack jig again just to put it on the side. And as fiddly as it gets now, as irritating as it gets, if you stick with it, you will have something good at the end. As painful as it is to watch me keep dropping these things now from here on in, a little bit of time spent and you'll have, quite simply, a very unique little die-cast project at the end of it. And another quick fitment just to see how we are clearance wise, width ways in the bay. So once you're happy with all that, it's time to add some of the ignition leads. Not everybody's going to do this. Not every car has them quite obviously coming out of the top. Some of them are hidden under shrouds and all sorts, but for this purpose I'll show you. I won't glue them in place at this stage because I'll do that at the end because of us painting it as we go along. But once you've marked out where you want the leads to go, use your little hand drill to drill down, and some of this little wire that I pulled out of some old electronics is good to go. And you can use some little bead wire, some little craft making bead wire, but you'd be amazed at what you're throwing out you can come up with. So adding some little details as we go along now, a little piece of 1mm bar cut down to replicate the oil filler, and then a little bit of 1/2mm on top of 1.5mm creates a little replica pulley wheel, should I say. And you start adding little bits on top and you start to come out with the finished article. I've drilled a little hole just on the side of this intake now, which I'll put some wire in at the end to show you, some of the bead wire. And there we pretty much have the backbone of the engine, albeit to nothing specific. But if I just quickly go around some of the other engines, you can add other details such as some cut down insulation tape to replicate a cam belt. You could add some tubing on top of tubing to create turbo looks like that, and even melt down some other tubing and flare it out to create an air filter such as that. Some extra little tube bits on top of the engine block, some more tube with some flat pieces on top, and then some more bar and tube on top to create carburetors. Other than these sections, you don't really need a great deal in your arsenal with this styrene. Just some flat pieces, some bar, some tube, no more than 2mm, and you pretty much can create anything. So with this wiring then, what I will just quickly point out then, when I mentioned the bead wire, the wiring doesn't seem to conform a lot, so you will have to do quite a bit of gluing and pulling around. Whereas the bead wire, as it suggests, is a lot more easy to conform, but also has its own problems where getting into tight spaces where the wire would work. But nevertheless, the thicker stuff, the bead wire, is good for other pieces of tubing and other ancillary pipe work, if you like, within the engine. It's all down to your preference at the end, really. So 2 more little tips I'll show you at the end is radiators, intercoolers, oil coolers, and there's lots of people that do this. I tend to use a piece of styrene which I put in the middle of it for reasons I'll show you in a second, but if you just oversize it and cut enough out that you can bend the paper clip around, what we'll end up doing is by putting another little slither over the top, you can actually replicate the top of the intercooler, radiator, oil coolers, whatever you're doing at this stage. And once you've bent it, it's really tough, so just watch your fingers at this stage. You can put it in a few pieces of, sorry, you can actually put it in a pair of pliers, but I tend to then separate all the staples at this stage. So once you've bent it around, that little slither at the top that's now showing, once you cut another little section of the sheet out and place it on the top, you can create the top of the radiator intercooler. Obviously you need to paint it, but all the little bits that you've been cutting and shifting to the side, more often than not you can find some lovely little bits to add to your detail. And as I was cutting some of the round, there should be some little round pieces left in, which will be perfect to stick on top as a little expansion cap. And that is pretty much a straightforward, quick way to making one of these little pieces. And then finally, I put it in a video not so long back again, an exhaust, but since we're doing engine work, I might as well add this to it very quickly. And how I make exhaust is a little electrical ferrule, some more of this solder wire which you can bend around and contour around the bottom of the car, and then a little piece of tubing, just the right size of the solder wire. More often than not it won't fit the other end for the little exhaust tip with this ferrule, so you will have to do some drilling. But once you've drilled that little end out, one end of the ferrule, however you pronounce it, should sit just nicely snug in the end of it, like so. It's got a nice little flared end for the exhaust tip, and then with the other piece pushed into the end, once it's all glued in place and you've painted that little back box section silver, it replicates the little exhaust rather nicely. So all that really needs to be done now is a little bit of paint work just to finish all these cars off, and I don't want to bore you too much with the painting, so it's all down to personal choice, but I tend to paint them all silver first, or start with a lighter colour and build up with the greys, the reds or the blacks. Add some little dry brush work in for some of the little areas just to highlight the shadows, and a bit like on this long block one there, just highlight some of the ridges in the top of that engine. Maybe add some blues for some silicone hosing, and towards the end this is what you will finally end up with sort of a few hours work, gluing, painting, adding some little bits of wires. You'll have a little engine, albeit not to any specific car, but you get the gist of my little method of how I go about doing these. So here we have a final little item, and then down to your own preference at the end with the painting and other wiring. All you need to do now is just install it into a car. So here we have the finished item installed. I haven't gone to town with any other parts in that engine bay, or there any wiring or other electrical parts. It's just straightforward to give you an idea of how it all looks, and with your imagination coming up with other little oil coolers to go on the fronts, radiators, batteries, strut braces. Your world's your oyster with it, but I just hope that this has given you some idea. So without throwing another spanner in the works, there is another video I'll put in the link to an older car where you can actually refurb an old engine by using some of these methods, which is halfway there. So I hope you all like it. I hope it is what you're all after. Please share all your creations on my Facebook. Until next time, as always, thanks for watching.